The letter arrived on Tuesday morning, while the frost still clung to the windows of Hartmore Hall. It came by the hand of a boy who had ridden through the night, his coat dark with rain, his knuckles white around the reins. He did not knock so much as collapse against the door, and when the housekeeper opened it, he said only one thing before pressing the folded parchment into her hands. For the young mistress. Urgent. No one in the house knew, not yet, that this single letter would unravel a fortune, a name, and a lie that had waited 11 years to be told. The wax seal bore no crest. That alone was strange enough to make the housekeeper hesitate before carrying it up the narrow stairs, past the portraits that lined the hall, stern men in dark coats, their painted eyes following her the way they always seemed to, as if the dead of Hartmore still kept watch over the living. She found Eleanor Ashworth exactly where she always was at that hour, seated by the cold hearth of the small east room, a shawl drawn over her shoulders, her hands folded in her lap, as though she had long ago stopped expecting anything to arrive for her at all. "A letter, miss," the housekeeper said. "No name on it. Only yours." Eleanor did not move for a long moment. She had learned, in the years since her father's death, that letters rarely brought comfort. They brought debts, they brought demands, they brought the quiet cruelty of men who signed their names beneath words they would never have said to her face. But this letter was different, and she would not understand how different until she had read it twice. Before we go further into Eleanor's story, if you're the kind of person who loves getting lost in a slow-burning tale of old England, hidden rooms, and women who are underestimated until they can no longer be ignored, this channel is exactly where you belong. Press subscribe now so you never miss the next story. And while the fire is still low and the letter still unopened in Eleanor's hands, tell us in the comments below, where are you watching from tonight? I read every single one, and I love knowing how far these old English halls travel to reach you. Now, back to Hartmore. Eleanor broke the seal with trembling fingers. The handwriting inside was cramped, hurried, as though the author had written it in secret, glancing over his own shoulder as the ink dried. It was signed only with the initial W, and it spoke of a debt owed to her late father, a debt that had never been settled, and a name Eleanor had not heard spoken aloud in over a decade. Duke Ashford Wren. She read the name 3 times before she trusted her own eyes. It was the Duke's estate, Hartmore's nearest and grandest neighbour, that had once employed her father as steward, before the accusations, before the disgrace, before the Ashworth name became something whispered rather than spoken. Her father had died believing himself ruined. He had died, Eleanor now understood with a cold and creeping certainty, believing a lie that someone else had built around him. The letter told her only this, that the Duke wished to see her, that there was a matter of unfinished business between their two families, that she should come to Ashwood Park before the month's end, or the truth, whatever truth the letter's author meant, would be buried with the last person who knew it. Eleanor did not sleep that night. To understand why a single letter could undo 11 years of quiet suffering, one must first understand what had been lost. Eleanor Ashworth had not always sat by cold hearths in borrowed shawls. She had been raised, until the age of 13, in a fine stone house not unlike the one whose lights she could see glowing faintly on the hill each evening, Ashwood Park, seat of the Duke of Wren, where her father had served as steward for nearly 20 years. He had been a good man, careful with numbers, gentle with people, respected by every tenant on the estate. And then, in the space of one terrible autumn, everything he had built had been taken from him. The accusation came suddenly: theft from the estate's coffers, falsified ledgers, a sum large enough to ruin a family twice over. Eleanor's father had denied it until his last breath, but denial mattered little against the word of a duke's household. He was dismissed without pension, without reference, without the dignity of a proper hearing, Within 2 years, the shame and the debt had taken what illness alone could not, and Eleanor buried him beside her mother in a churchyard too far from Ashwood Park for anyone from that house to attend. She had been 16. She inherited nothing but his name, and even that had become difficult to carry. The journey to Thornfield took the better part of 2 days, and Isabel spent much of it composing and abandoning, in equal measure, the various speeches she imagined herself delivering to whichever member of the family finally received her. She arrived, in the end, saying almost nothing at all, ushered not to the great house itself, but directly to the small, weathered gatehouse at the estate's furthest boundary, where an elderly steward named Mr. Price awaited her with an expression that suggested he found the entire arrangement as puzzling as she did. "His Grace sends his regrets that he could not receive you personally," Price said, though his tone carried little conviction that any genuine regret existed on the Duke's part. "He asks only that you keep the gatehouse in reasonable order, and that you make no particular effort to trouble the household at the main house regarding matters that do not concern you." "And the bridge?" Isabel asked, glancing toward the collapsed stone structure visible beyond the gatehouse's small garden, its central span fallen entirely into the river below. Weeds and moss claiming what remained of its ancient arches. "Fallen these past 6 years, miss. Cost more to repair than His Grace has ever judged it worth, given how few travellers this road sees now that the main crossing further south serves most purposes well enough. I shouldn't trouble yourself over it, if I were you. No one else has." Isabel studied the ruined bridge for a long moment, understanding, with a clarity that surprised her, precisely why it had been chosen for her exile. It was not merely distant from the house, it was a symbol, whether the Duke had intended it consciously or not, of exactly the kind of quiet, permanent neglect he wished to extend toward her. Visible enough that no one could claim she had been entirely abandoned, but broken and forgotten enough that no one would ever expect anything worthwhile to come of the arrangement. She did not yet know that the bridge's collapse held secrets considerably more complicated than simple neglect, or that untangling those secrets would eventually lead her back to the very accusation that had exiled her from Thornfield 8 years before. She met the Duke himself only 3 days after her arrival, and not, as she had half expected, by any deliberate summons on his part. She encountered him instead at the boundary between the gatehouse grounds and the wider estate, where she had gone walking in the late afternoon light, still unsettled by the strange, hollow quiet of a house she had once, briefly, called home. He did not recognize her at first. 8 years and considerable change had passed since she had last stood before him. Herself scarcely more than a girl at the time, and his own memory of that distant cousin's disgrace had clearly grown vague with disuse. It was only when she gave her name, watching his expression shift from polite confusion to something considerably more guarded, that he understood precisely whom he addressed. "Miss Merrow," he said finally, "I had not expected to encounter you so directly. Your solicitor's letter did not specify that I should avoid the grounds entirely, Your Grace, merely that I should not trouble the household. I confess I did not realize a simple walk constituted trouble." Something flickered across his face, not quite amusement, though close enough to it that Isabel found herself, despite everything, briefly unsettled by the resemblance to warmth. "No," he admitted, "I suppose it doesn't." He did not linger in conversation, offering only a brief, formal inquiry into whether the gatehouse suited her needs before continuing on whatever business had originally brought him to that corner of the estate. But Isabel noticed, watching him go, that his gaze had drifted, more than once during their brief exchange, toward the collapsed bridge beyond the gatehouse garden, a look that carried something considerably more complicated than the simple indifference Mr. Price's account had suggested. She did not yet understand what that look meant, or why a bridge the Duke claimed not worth the cost of repair should draw his attention with such evident, unwilling weight. That understanding would come only gradually, over the weeks that followed, as she began, almost despite herself, to take a genuine interest in the ruin she had been sent to quietly ignore. Isabel's first weeks at the gatehouse passed in the particular quiet rhythm of a woman rebuilding, once again, a life reduced to its barest essentials. She kept the small cottage in careful order, tended the modest garden Price's predecessor had apparently once maintained with more enthusiasm than the current steward troubled himself with, and found, in the solitude of that remote corner of the estate, a peace she had not expected to feel so soon after her return to a place that had once caused her such profound humiliation. It was the bridge itself, in the end, that drew her attention most persistently, not out of any particular ambition, at first, but simply because it stood so constantly within view of the gatehouse's small windows. A daily reminder of ruin that gradually, over those first quiet weeks, began to feel less like an accident of geography and more like a puzzle she had not yet fully understood. She began walking its length in the early mornings, when mist still clung to the river below, studying the pattern of its collapse with the careful attention she had once applied, as a girl, to her father's rare stories of the estate's history. The central span had fallen cleanly, she noted, in a manner that struck her the more closely she examined it, as somewhat peculiar for a structure claimed to have simply succumbed to age and neglect. The stonework at the break showed signs, faint but unmistakable to a careful eye, of deliberate weakening rather than gradual decay, chisel marks along certain load-bearing points that no natural erosion could easily explain. She mentioned this observation to no one at first, uncertain whether her own suspicion reflected genuine discovery or simply the restless imagination of a woman with too much solitary time and too many old grievances still unresolved. But the observation lodged itself in her mind regardless, refusing to be dismissed, and she found herself returning to the bridge again and again over the following weeks, gathering small details that gradually, piece by piece, began to suggest a history considerably more deliberate than simple accident. If Isabel's story is pulling you in the way it pulled me in while writing it, this is only the beginning of what's hidden beneath that collapsed bridge. Make sure you're subscribed, because what she uncovers next connects directly back to the very accusation that exiled her from Thornfield 8 years ago. And I still want to hear from you. Drop your city or country in the comments below. I love watching this map fill up, with all of you listening from around the world. The first true clue arrived not from the bridge itself, but from an elderly woman named Mrs. Tillett, who kept a small cottage near the ruined crossing, and who had lived, by her own account, within sight of that bridge for the better part of 60 years. Fell strange, that bridge did, Mrs. Tillett said one afternoon, when Isabel had stopped to exchange the particular quiet courtesies neighbours extend in remote corners of large estates. I remember the night well enough, though I was younger then and thought little of it beyond the noise. Autumn storm, they said, weakened the old stonework, past bearing, but I recall, clear as anything, seeing lantern light along the bridge itself the evening before its collapse, men working at something in the dark, though I couldn't rightly say what, and no one ever spoke of repairs being carried out that night, before or since. Do you remember who the men were, Mrs. Tillett? The old woman considered the question with the particular slowness of memory reaching far back into years grown thin. Estate men, I always assumed, though I couldn't swear to faces at that distance and hour. There was talk, for a time, that the old Duke himself, the current one's father, that would be, had ordered the bridge weakened deliberately, though I never understood why anyone would trouble themselves to ruin a perfectly serviceable crossing. The talk died down soon enough, the way such things do, and I confess I'd nearly forgotten it myself until you asked. Isabel thanked Mrs. Tillett and continued her walk with her mind considerably more unsettled than before. A bridge deliberately weakened, on the very estate where she had once been falsely accused of theft, in the years surrounding what she now understood, with growing unease, might not have been entirely separate incidents after all. She did not yet see the full shape of the connection. But she understood. with the particular clarity that comes from patient, careful observation. That Thornfield's quiet corners held considerably more secrets than the great house's polished public rooms had ever troubled themselves to reveal. It was in the gatehouse itself, some weeks later, that Isabel found the discovery that finally began to connect the bridge's suspicious collapse to her own long-buried disgrace. She had been clearing a small, disused storage room at the cottage's rear, unused, by all appearances, for years beyond counting, when she discovered, tucked behind a loose panel in the room's old wooden wall, a small collection of papers that had clearly been hidden there deliberately and left undisturbed since. They belonged, she understood almost immediately from the careful, familiar handwriting, to the gatehouse's previous occupant, a woman named Sarah Loft, who had served, Isabel gathered from the papers themselves, as companion to the old Duchess during the very years surrounding Isabel's own disgrace and exile. The papers were not a formal journal, but a series of private notes, seemingly written for no audience beyond the author's own troubled conscience. They described, in increasingly anxious detail, a growing suspicion that the old Duchess's missing brooch, the very item whose disappearance had condemned Isabel 8 years before, had never truly been stolen at all, but had instead been deliberately planted among Isabel's belongings by someone within the household determined to see the young girl removed from Thornfield entirely. "I do not know who bears the true blame," one entry read, in handwriting grown visibly unsteady with the weight of what it described, though I have my suspicions I dare not commit fully to paper, even here, where I trust no eyes but my own will ever fall upon these words. The girl wept most piteously, protesting her innocence with a conviction I confess troubled me greatly at the time, though I said nothing, coward that I was, fearing what speaking against the old Duchess's certainty might cost my own modest position in this household. Isabel read that entry 3 times before she trusted herself to fully understand its weight. She had not imagined her own innocence, all those years of quiet, private certainty against a household's collective condemnation. Someone at Thornfield had deliberately engineered her disgrace, for reasons the old companion's guilty notes did not yet fully explain. She did not yet understand what connection, if any, existed between her own false accusation and the bridge's suspicious collapse, both occurring within the same troubled years of Thornfield's history. That connection, she suspected, lay buried somewhere deeper still in the estate's guarded past. The connection revealed itself gradually, over the following weeks, through a combination of careful observation and the reluctant, piecemeal cooperation of servants who had, Isabel came to understand, spent years maintaining a careful silence about matters they privately found deeply troubling. It was Mr. Price himself, growing gradually more sympathetic to Isabel's quiet, persistent questions, who finally offered the piece that connected every earlier thread. He confided, one grey afternoon, as they walked the boundary near the ruined bridge, that the current Duke's own father had harboured, in his final years, a growing and increasingly desperate fear that Isabel's own father, his younger brother, had left behind, before his early death. Documentation proving an inheritance claim considerably stronger than the family had ever publicly acknowledged. There was talk, among the older servants when I first came to this position, that your father held papers proving Thornfield's succession ought properly to have passed differently than it did, some old entailment matter. Complicated enough that I confess I never fully understood the particulars myself. The old Duke feared, I believe, that such papers might one day surface and unsettle his own son's inheritance. And the bridge? Price's expression grew carefully guarded. The bridge crossed toward the old parish records office, Miss, in the village 3 miles distant, where such entailment papers would have been formally recorded and preserved. I cannot say with certainty that its collapse was connected to your father's claim, but I confess the timing has always struck me as considerably more convenient than simple accident usually allows. Isabel understood, in that moment, the full shape of what had happened to her 8 years before. She had not been exiled from Thornfield merely out of simple family coldness or dislike. She had been deliberately, calculatedly removed, her reputation destroyed through a planted accusation, precisely because her continued presence at Thornfield and her father's buried claim threatened an inheritance the old Duke had determined, by whatever means necessary, to protect for his own son. The bridge's collapse, she now understood, had likely served the same desperate purpose, severing, however temporarily, the most direct route to records that might have proven her father's claim, buying the old Duke time to ensure whatever documentation existed was quietly, permanently suppressed before anyone thought to seek it out. Before we see what Isabel does with this discovery, I need to ask you again, if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the moment, because what happens next is the reason this story exists at all. And for those of you who've already told me where you're watching from, thank you. For anyone who hasn't yet, the comments are still open, and I truly do read every single one. Isabel brought her discoveries to the current Duke with considerably more caution than her earlier certainty might have suggested, understanding that whatever role his own father had played in her disgrace, the current Duke himself had inherited a position built, at least in part, upon a foundation of deliberate deception he might not have personally constructed, but had certainly, comfortably, benefited from ever since. She laid before him, in the same small study where he had once offered her only the barest formal courtesy, Sarah Loft's guilty private notes, Mrs. Tillette's account of lantern light along the bridge the night before its collapse, and Mr. Price's careful, reluctant testimony regarding her father's suppressed inheritance claim. He read through each piece in silence, his expression growing increasingly troubled, until finally he set the papers down and looked at her with something that might, in a less guarded man, have been genuine distress. "My own father," he said quietly, "engineered your disgrace and quite possibly destroyed a bridge, to protect an inheritance that may never have rightfully belonged to either of us at all. I cannot yet prove the full extent of it, Your Grace, but the pattern is difficult to dismiss as mere coincidence, however much I suspect you might wish to." He did not argue the point, though Isabel watched him wrestle, visibly, with the full weight of what her discoveries implied. Not merely a private family cruelty, but a question that might, if properly proven, unsettle the very inheritance he had spent his entire adult life assuming was rightfully, uncomplicatedly his own. "What do you intend to do with this?" he asked finally. "I intend, Your Grace, to see the truth properly established, whatever it ultimately proves. I do not seek to unseat you from a title I have no particular ambition to claim for myself. I seek only what should have been extended to me 8 years ago, and was instead deliberately, cruelly withheld, an honest accounting of what actually happened, rather than the convenient lie your family has maintained ever since." The search for her father's original documentation consumed the better part of the following month, conducted with a thoroughness that surprised even Isabel herself, who had not expected the Duke's own resources to be extended so readily toward uncovering a truth that might yet complicate his own position considerably. They found, eventually, in the parish records office the bridge's collapse had once made so difficult to reach, exactly what Price's careful account had suggested: formal documentation, decades old but still legally valid, establishing that Isabel's father had indeed held a claim to Thornfield's succession that the family's later arrangements had quietly, deliberately overlooked. The claim, once properly examined by solicitors the Duke himself engaged for the purpose, proved considerably more limited in its practical effect than the old Duke's evident panic might have suggested. A matter, in the end, more easily resolved through formal acknowledgement and modest financial settlement than any true unseating of the current Duke's position. But the acknowledgement itself mattered enormously to Isabel, in ways she had not fully anticipated, until the solicitor's formal letter finally arrived, confirming in careful legal language what she had known, privately and without proof, for the better part of 8 years, that she had been wronged, deliberately and calculatedly, by a family determined to protect its own comfortable fiction at whatever cost her own reputation required. What followed the truth's full establishment was not a dramatic public reckoning, but something slower and, in its own quiet way, considerably more meaningful. The Duke saw to it that Isabel's name was formally, properly cleared among the county's solicitors and record keepers. The old theft accusation officially struck from whatever informal record had followed her these 8 years. He offered, too, a settlement considerably beyond what the modest legal claim alone required, in acknowledgement of what his own father's deception had cost her. Isabel accepted only what fairness genuinely demanded, declining the more generous portions of his offer with a quiet firmness that seemed, if anything, to increase rather than diminish the Duke's evident respect for her. What she asked for instead, when he pressed her to name some further recompense, was considerably simpler and considerably more meaningful to the life she had begun. Almost without noticing, to build for herself at Thornfield's quiet eastern boundary. She asked that the bridge be properly restored. The restoration began that same autumn, funded generously from the estate's own resources and directed, at Isabel's insistence, according to plans that would ensure the crossing served the surrounding villages properly for generations to come, rather than simply patching over whatever damage the original sabotage had caused. She worked alongside the estate's masons and engineers with a genuine growing interest in the project's progress, understanding, as the new stonework gradually rose to replace what deliberate cruelty had once destroyed, that she was rebuilding considerably more than a simple river crossing. Mrs. Tillett, who had first offered the crucial memory of lantern light along the doomed bridge, lived nearby enough to watch the restoration's progress from her own cottage window, and she took evident, quiet satisfaction in seeing the crossing finally repaired after so many years of neglect. "I always thought it a shame," she told Isabel, watching the new central span slowly take shape above the river, seeing good stonework left to ruin over whatever old grievance caused it. "Glad I am to see it mended, whatever the true story behind its falling." By the time winter's first frost arrived, the bridge stood whole again for the first time in 6 years, solid, properly engineered, considerably sturdier than the original structure, whatever deliberate weakness had once compromised it. Isabel stood at its centre on the morning of its formal reopening, watching the first travellers in years cross the River Thorn without the long, difficult detour the ford had required, and felt something settle within her that she had not expected to feel so completely. Not merely vindication, though vindication mattered considerably, but the particular satisfaction of having built something genuinely useful from ground everyone else had long since abandoned as hopeless. If Eleanor's story is pulling you in the way it pulled me in while writing it, this is only the beginning of what's hidden in that weaving house. Make sure you're subscribed, because what she finds in her father's letters next changes everything we think we know about why he really lost everything. And I still want to hear from you. Drop your city or country in the comments. I love watching this map fill up with all of you listening from around the world. It was the letters, in the end, that finished the story her father had never been allowed to finish himself. Eleanor read them slowly, over several nights, by the same candlelight that had once illuminated her earliest attempts at the loom. They were not confessions of guilt, as she had feared for 11 long years. They were the opposite, careful, methodical records her father had kept in secret, documenting discrepancies in the estate's accounts that predated his own employment, discrepancies he had traced, quietly and at great personal risk, to a young steward's assistant who had since risen, through connections and charm, to a far more comfortable position than the one he had once held at Ashwood Park. Her father had not stolen from the estate. He had discovered who had, and rather than being thanked for his honesty, he had been made to carry the blame, silenced, Eleanor now understood, by someone who had far more to lose than a steward's reputation and far more power to protect himself with. She brought the letters to the Duke herself, her hands steady this time, though her heart was not. He read them in silence, his expression darkening with each page, until finally he set them down and looked at her with something that might have been shame. "This man," he said quietly, naming the steward's former assistant, now a respected land agent 2 counties away, still does business with this family. "I am aware, Your Grace, your father protected my family's name at the cost of his own, and no one ever thought to ask why the numbers never quite added up after he was dismissed." No one thought to ask, Eleanor agreed, because it was easier not to. The Duke did not offer easy apologies, and Eleanor did not expect them. But in the weeks that followed, quietly and without the fanfare such things sometimes demand, he saw to it that the truth was made known where it mattered, to the estate's solicitors, to the family's private records, to the small circle of people whose good opinion had once mattered enormously to a man who was no longer alive to benefit from it. The confrontation with Fenwick, when it finally came, was quieter than Eleanor had imagined it in the long nights she had spent preparing for it. The Duke summoned him to the very study where Eleanor had first been offered the ruined loom, and laid before him, without preamble, the torn ledger page and the careful letters her father had kept hidden for 11 years. Fenwick did not confess, not outright. Men of his sort rarely do. He spoke, instead of misunderstandings, of a young steward too proud to admit his own errors, of the unreliability of memory after so many years had passed. But his composure, so carefully maintained through dinner and pleasantries, began to fracture under the Duke's steady, unrelenting questions, and by the time he left Ashwood Park 2 days later, earlier than planned, and without the warm farewell Lord Halden had expected to give his guest, it was clear to everyone in the household that something essential had shifted. The Duke did not ruin Fenwick publicly. That was never truly the point, and Eleanor had not sought it. But quietly, over the following months, contracts were not renewed, invitations quietly ceased, and the comfortable reputation Fenwick had spent 11 years building on the foundation of another man's disgrace began, slowly and irreversibly, to erode. It was not the dramatic justice of a courtroom. It was something slower, and in its own way, far more fitting. The same quiet patience that had rebuilt a broken loom now turned toward unmaking a lie, thread by thread. It could not undo 11 years of grief. It could not return to Eleanor the childhood she had lost, or the father who had died believing himself disgraced. But it gave her something almost as valuable, the truth, finally spoken aloud, in the very house where the lie had first taken root. By the following spring, the weaving house at Ashwood Park no longer resembled the ruin Eleanor had first stepped into. New apprentices had been brought in from the village to help meet the growing demand for her cloth. Mrs. Pruitt, who had once doubted her most openly, now spoke of her with something close to pride whenever visitors asked about the fine fabrics worn by the ladies of the county. Lady Prescott had not been Eleanor's only patron for long. Word of the weaver at Ashwood Park had travelled well beyond the county's borders, carried by the same wealthy women who had once idly wondered where such fine wool could be found. By midsummer, Eleanor's cloth was being worn not only by barons' wives, but by the daughters of earls, and, though she scarcely believed it when the commission arrived, by a lady in waiting at court itself. The Duke, for his part, never publicly acknowledged how thoroughly his small test of patience had transformed. But those who knew him well noticed the change in the way he spoke of the weaving house, no longer as an afterthought. An old ruin given away to occupy a poor relation of a disgraced steward, but as one of the finest achievements to come out of Ashwood Park in a generation. Eleanor did not need his acknowledgement, though she understood, in some quiet way, that it mattered to him to give it. She had not built this to prove herself to a duke. She had built it to prove something far more important to herself, that the girl who had once sat beside her father, unafraid and capable, had never truly disappeared. She had only been waiting for the chance to be seen again. Years later, when people spoke of Ashwood Park's famous weaving house, they rarely spoke of the ruined loom it had once been, or the young woman no one expected to succeed with it. They spoke instead of the fine cloth worn in the finest houses in England, of the quiet weaver whose work had become, in its own way, as celebrated as the estate itself. But those who knew the fuller story, the letter that arrived on a Tuesday morning, the box hidden beneath a warped floorboard, the truth that had waited 11 years to be spoken, understood that the cloth was never really the point. It was proof. Proof that a name, once disgraced, could be restored. Proof that patience, however quiet, could outlast even the cruelest assumptions. And proof, most of all, that the people so easily dismissed by those with power are often the very ones who go on to build something that outlasts them all. Agatha Doyle lived long enough to see the weaving house in its full glory, though her hands grew too unsteady in later years to work the loom herself. She spent her final winters instead by the weaving house fire, watching a new generation of village girls learn the trade she had once feared would die with her, offering corrections in a voice grown soft with age, but no less certain than it had ever been. When she passed, Eleanor buried her in the same churchyard as her own father, and had a small stone marker carved with a line she remembered Agatha saying more than once, in that same firm, unhurried voice, "The loom does not care who you were born to. It only cares whether you were willing to learn." The Duke, in the years that followed, never spoke publicly of the wrong done to Eleanor's father, but he did not need to. Those who mattered had learnt the truth, and those who did not were of little consequence to either of them by then. He visited the weaving house often in later years, not as a duke inspecting his property, but as something closer to a quiet friend, content to sit by the fire while Eleanor worked, saying little, needing to say little, the silence between them long since grown comfortable rather than strained. There is a particular satisfaction in watching a story come full circle, in seeing a broken thing made whole again, not by luck, but by patience and skill and the quiet refusal to accept another person's verdict as the final word on one's own worth. Eleanor Ashworth had arrived at Ashwood Park 11 years after her family's ruin, offered nothing but a warped loom and 6 months to prove it had not been a waste of anyone's time. She had needed far less time than that. And what she built in the years that followed outlasted every doubt that had ever been spoken against her. Outlasted, in the end, even the disgrace itself, until it was her father's name, and not his accusers, that was remembered with respect in that county for generations to come. Eleanor Ashworth never forgot the winter she was given a broken loom to waste her time. She simply made certain that everyone else did. And that's where we'll leave Eleanor's story tonight. If you enjoyed this one, there are many more waiting for you on this channel. Old estates, hidden letters, women who were never quite as easy to break as everyone assumed. Subscribe if you haven't already, so the next story finds you the moment it's ready. And before you go, tell me one more time in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? Thank you for spending this evening at Ashwood Park with me. I'll see you in the next one.